Hey listeners, thank you so much for listening to HRN. We want to make your experience as a listener even better, and to help us do that, we'd love your input on our audience survey. It'll only take a few minutes, and by completing it, you can enter to win a $250 gift card from Goldbelly. Visit heritageradionetwork.org/survey to take the survey and to help us keep growing and improving. That's heritageradionetwork.org/survey. Thanks for your support.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Welcome to the Grape Nation, your weekly wine journey. Our guest is Kelli White. We'll talk to Kelli about wine, her new book, and more. I'm your host, Sam Ben-Ruby. Stay with us for the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We bring wine to the people. Kelli White is an educator, sommelier, and an award-winning journalist and author. After somming at two of America's great wine restaurants, Veritas and Press, Kelli continued her love of wine by writing about it for Vinous, Somm Press, and Guild Somm, among many others. She published her first book, Napa Valley Then and Now, in 2015, a doorstop of essential reading about the Napa Valley. She is now the Director of Education at the Wine Center at Meadowood in St. Helena, out in Napa Valley. Kelli just published her latest book, Wine Confident. There's no wrong way to enjoy wine. A book for all people with a love and interest in wine. The book is now available, just became recently available, and that's why Kelli's on the show. Welcome to the Grape Nation, Kelli.
Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, so we are talking to Kelli remotely via our Zencastr app. Kelli and I are sitting in front of our computers. We made every attempt to do this interview in person, mostly in New York City, but couldn't get it together. So here we are. Still very happy about that. Congratulations on your new book, Wine Confident, Kelli.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We're going to get to the book in a few minutes, but I want to take advantage of the fact that I have you here to talk about a bunch of other things.
Okay.
It's always nice for people to talk about their past, to set up a little context. I know you've done this over and over. I think, and I think I'm right, that you have a pretty interesting past. So I want to talk about that a little. I know you grew up in Massachusetts. It seemed like you didn't grow up around wine, but sort of fell into it out of necessity. Before we jump into your wine journey, you were an exceptionally bright kid.
Yeah, I did okay.
I think sophomore year, you went to your guidance counselor and said, I'm bored or something, and he sent you to a better school.
Oh, boy.
Did that happen?
Yeah, you've done your research. You're going way back.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I threatened to drop out of high school. Yeah.
So what happened? You just bored, and where did you go? I mean, you went to a specific school?
So
that?
I was in this really kind of overcrowded, very nice, but overcrowded, probably under-resourced public high school. And I was, they were very kind to me. They were really understanding of my needs, but I was, a sophomore in high school, and I was, by the end of that year, I would have completed all of the school's math and science, advanced math and science courses. And so I, talked to the guidance counselor. I'm like, so then what happens after that? And they were basically like, study hall, And
Okay.
So I ended up in a study hall, and I'm sitting in this study hall, and people are, there's not even enough seats. There's some kids sitting on like those big fat windowsills, and somebody starts picking linoleum tiles off the back and chucking them around the room, and a piece hit the kid next to me, and I thought, that, I'm out of here.
That's enough.
What am I
God.
doing? So I went to the guidance counselor or the principal. I'm not quite sure. And I just said, you know what? I'm just there's really nothing left for me here. I think I'll just get my GED and then I will join the workforce because I'm not going to just sit here quietly with my hands folded for 2 years. That's a 2.5 years. That's a waste of everybody's time. And so the principal and the guidance counselor were really wonderful. They sort of immediately were like, no. Let's figure something out. And they got me in some night classes at the local community college, but that just also sort of wasn't it. And then they found this school, this kind of random school that's still, I think my mother forwarded me something that it was just rated like second in the nation for free schools. It was a free school if you
Wow.
could get in, as a magnet school called
Was
the
it near where you lived?
Sort of. It was a 45-minute drive.
Okay.
And so I applied. They take 30 students a year from all over. And I got waitlisted and then eventually got in. And it was a math and science focused 2-year program in the sort of the basement of the library of a college in Worcester, Massachusetts called WPI. And my mom is this amazing single mom. She was working in a steel factory at the time, and
Wow.
there wasn't a lot, there wasn't a lot of extra stuff to go around. And she found a way to get herself a new used car so that I could have her car because, 45 minutes of a commute is long for a 16-year-old. So
Sure.
she gave me I'm born in 1980. She gave me a car that was born in 1982. And she said, this car just has to get you to graduation. And it was so, this car was so atrocious by the time I was done with it, being like a careless teenager, that
Right.
if you sat in the back, you couldn't even put your feet on the floor because you could see the road through the metal
Oh
was
my God.
wearing away. And my high school superlative was best car. Anyway, she had always said, look, it just needs to get you to graduation, needs to get you to graduation. Well, graduation day, I pulled in early to unload some stuff, and my car effectively blew up in front of the school. So
Well,
it
you
died
did it.
dramatically on graduation day, but it got me there. It got me there. It did its
You
job.
did it. Um, Listen, it sounds like there were two great people in your life. Certainly your mom, who
Yeah.
it sounded like she did anything. And it's amazing at your school that, they stepped up, recognized, who you were and advocated for you. I mean, listen, you didn't mention this, but you studied neuroscience. You were very creative. You played the guitar.
Oh,
You sounded a little nerdy and you sounded a little cool.
yeah.
But let's talk. You had bands and all that, but let's talk about the fact that you eventually morphed from studying neuroscience to the arts and then to wine. So
Hmm.
at that point, you graduate high school. Take me through your journey from, I guess from college and that job in the wine shop, its effect, and all the way up to the book. And then we'll talk about the book.
Wow. Okay. We're gonna we're gonna do it. This is really
Quickly, the
going,
whole
this
show
is
is not
going.
about your history. It's
Oh,
about the
okay.
book too.
Well, you got me all excited about high school. Okay. So, all right. So basically, I go to school, assuming that I'm going to, study the sciences in a really kind of hardcore way. And so I picked a university outside Boston called Brandeis that at the time had more MacArthur Genius Award winning researchers than any other. And I wanted to be able to major in neuroscience as an undergrad instead of having to wait to grad school. So I was so sure this is what I was doing. And I go there and I'm in the program and I get a job in a neurogenetics lab. And it was just the worst. It was so bad. I mean, you and
I
I
could
have
have told you that, but good for
yeah, it
you.
was. I mean, God bless these, these medical researchers. That is some
Yeah.
slow, tedious, tough work, and it is just not for me. And so after 2 years of that, I thought, oh boy, I hadn't really been cultivating any other skills, and as corny as it sounds, I got this grant the summer after sophomore year, I guess, to perform an experiment of my own, and I came in under budget. So I had extra money, and I had a friend studying abroad in France, and I went to visit him. And, it was very much like an American's first experience to Europe kind of teenage epiphany. And I've spent most of the time in museums, which I hadn't ever really done as a kid. In a serious way. And it was just unbelievable to me, just so intellectually rich and exciting. And I thought, I could really see myself exploring this. And so I came back and I changed my major to art history and thought, well, when I was studying sciences, I worked in labs and I supported myself. And now I'm studying arts and I'll work in galleries and support myself. But the art industry, at least back then, was very much like geared towards, I guess, more people that don't need to work, right? People with independent means. So like most of the
Right.
positions were unpaid, which was just crazy to me because I thought, well, okay, but who's going to pay me? I need to cover my rent. I need to cover my expenses. And so I was sort of trying to figure this out when I was walking around in Boston and I saw a wine shop with a help wanted sign in the window. And it was just really as simple as that. I just needed a job, and I needed a job that whose schedule aligned with a kind of college kid schedule. So I needed something that was like nights, holidays, weekends, perfect. I'm your man. So I applied, they hired me. And not only did I not know anything about wine, I'd never drank, like pretty much almost never even had a sip up until this point. For a variety of reasons, I had a history of alcoholism in my family. And so it had this kind of scary, I thought, if I have a drink, then bam, immediately I'll be an alcoholic. I had these kind of immature ideas of what a relationship with alcohol would look like. But it was a really cute shop in a really posh part of Boston. And it was just like a kind of drawn in. It was very atmospheric. And so
Were
it was a
they,
wonderful
did
job.
they take a liking to you? Like, hey,
They were
come here,
great.
taste this, or let me explain this to you. It was a good
Yeah.
experience for you?
It was a
Okay.
super hands-on shop, and it's in Beacon Hill, if you know Boston. And
Great neighborhood.
yeah, great neighborhood. They were constantly opening wines to taste people that came in. And so the staff got to taste it, and we were all borrowing books from each other. And it was wonderful. And I absolutely loved the subject. I mean, I loved the languages and the wine labels. And I loved this kind of sensory evaluation piece. And I loved the cultural, span of wine, and that was really engaging. But I didn't like the alcohol part of it. I just like didn't have
Wait, you're
this.
the only person who didn't like getting buzzed?
Yeah, basically. I mean,
Okay.
I'm believe me, I'm over that now.
Okay.
At
Thank
the
God.
time,
You've matured.
it wasn't even about the buzz. It was about the taste. I thought, okay, if I'm going to study wine, I want to be fancy about this. And, what is the fanciest stuff that I can afford to try? And so I was, very aspirational in my tastes, but I had just no money. And so the wines I could afford to taste of the sort of established categories like Bordeaux and, things like that were not particularly inspiring. And I would say, I would argue that Cabernet specifically, or like tannic red wines, is not a baby. That's not a first wine.
No,
That's a sort of a more
no.
something you have to kind of build toward to understand structure and like a hint of bitterness and like all that power. You need to work your way up. And I just didn't. So I was trying to come in, I was like burning out in the atmosphere. I was trying to come in at a very high level, and it just wasn't, nothing kind of was landing. And so the punchline of that experience was that, after the summer, I was like, okay, this was awesome, thanks, like I'm going to figure out whatever the next job is that's not in a gallery, and finish my degree. And then I sort of sent myself off. I sent myself off with a little dinner. There was this cute restaurant, I can't remember the name of it now. Maybe it was called like Torch. I don't know, hopefully somebody listening would know, on Charles Street, that I would walk by every day. And it was one of those restaurants that was kind of like half sunk down in the street. So you're sort of, you're walking on the street, but you're looking down at the candlelit tables. And it was so cute. And I thought, well, I should, that would be a nice send off, like a present to myself. So I had this little dinner there, just me, and the sommelier, presumably the sommelier, um, sold me a bottle of white Rhone. It was a Chateauneuf de Pape Blanc, and it was one of those corny, lightning strike moments where the flavors were so sort of soft and squishy and yummy and inviting and easy and friendly and tasty. And and the food was perfect with it. And it was just magical. And that was really it's so silly to tell this story, but it is true that was, the
Well,
moment when I
that was an
got it.
interesting recommendation. I mean, it could have easily been, a Bordeaux or a California wine. I mean, that's not a common wine, still not on lists, very aromatic, big on the palate. So really, that type of wine, I could see how it really, brought you in. So this wine changed. So let me go back for a second. Your
Yeah.
interest in wine was fancy and tasting the best and all that.
Well, it was
I don't know.
academic. My interest in wine was academic. I liked the
Yeah,
sub.
but the
Yeah.
academic part, I think you're still interested in. As far as those fancy wines and all that, your thinking has changed, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I love Cabernet. I mean, I live in Napa Valley now, so that's certainly come around. But I think,
We're going to
your
talk
palate,
about that.
yeah, your palate grows and evolves, and but like I said, I made a comment in the book. It was like starting drinking coffee with a double espresso. Like
Right.
usually
Tough
you
move.
need like some cream, some sugar, maybe even a shot of French vanilla syrup. You need something to kind of
Right. Right.
get you there.
Interested or to stay with it. All right. So let's take that as a jumping point. So after the wine shop and this little dinner you put together, which really had an impression on, the way you thought, quickly, less detail, but more chronological. Tell me how things move along, because I know you sommed it, really two of literally the best wine places. I know you may have worked in importing, sales, or whatever. Just take me through what happened after that.
Okay, so I ended up moving to a different wine shop. And after school, when I graduated, I couldn't get a job in the arts that paid. So I ended up working full time at the wine shop in now Cambridge. So in between, in Central Square, in between Harvard and MIT. And actually did some really cool tastings, and even was, just to tie it back to the job I have now, approached by Harvard University to teach at their extension school. So 23
Wow.
years old at this point, working full time in wine, and now teaching classes in the evenings at Harvard a little bit, which was fun. And I did that for a number of years, but I wanted to experience more. And so I ended up leaving that job to work a harvest in Burgundy in 2005.
Nice.
And while I was in Burgundy, I believe, arranged to come back to my job in Boston and come back to my apartment. But the person who owned my apartment said they were selling it. And so I
Yeah.
realized I was kind of coming back to no job and no apartment. And I thought, well, screw it. I'll just move to New York. I had this idea that I wanted to move to New York. A lot of my friends from college lived in New York. I thought this is a perfect time to start over. So from Burgundy, I started to make arrangements to move to New York, and I moved to New York in, I guess the winter of 2005, going to work for the importer that had brought the winery I worked at in Burgundy into Massachusetts. So he hired me to open the New York market, which was crazy because I'd never done wine sales before. I didn't know New York. I'd never even ridden on the subway.
Wow.
And I didn't know any of the buyers, and none of them knew any of these producers because they were new to the market. And it was mostly Burgundy with some Rhone
Right.
and some Champagne. So that was tough. I mean,
That's tough. It's
that
like
was
the
tough.
craziest circumstance.
That was tough. That was
God.
tough.
So what
Um,
happens?
well, I mean, I'm very scrappy, and I rented a room, or effectively, my best friend in college, who's still my best friend. Both of her parents were professors at New York City University, so I stayed with them. I lived with them in their apartment in New York for the first 6 months while I was getting my feet under me. And so I think that was rent free, and I was selling wine, and the wines were really good. The portfolio was small and cute, but they had some real gems. And so I started to make some relationships, and started to build some momentum. But by the time it came time to start paying New York rent, it wasn't possible. So
Right.
I stopped doing that and went to work for Domain Select, which was, another sales position, and now Italian wine. and Austrian wine, but more of a, kind of a big business. So they had just more support. They had an office, they put you on a draw. It was just,
and more well-known brands, right?
Exactly. More, yeah. And so that was great. And I got a really high profile route there. I did like the Bastianich group, for example, like a lot of the high-end Italian on-premise accounts. So I had a good, that was great. And I was doing that for a couple of years. And then a friend of mine, Josh Nadell, I don't know if you know Josh.
I know Josh. He's with Andrew Carmelini.
Yeah, exactly. So back then he was at Crew, if you remember Crew, and
Crew and Veritas were, the craziest wine destinations. Anyway.
Yeah, they were. So this was before I'm at Veritas. So he's at Crew and I'm his sales rep, and we, have a great relationship, are tasting together. He's a lovely guy, and he recruits me to join the Somm team at the Oak Room. So Josh was in charge of the relaunch of the Oak Room and asked me to be one of the opening sommeliers, which was fine, except that I'd never worked in a restaurant before. And I'm really clumsy. And, it was a total crazy situation. And that was a tough one because I left my job at Domain Select to do that. And then the opening got seriously delayed. Okay. So like months and months of delay. And so the staff that was hired, I think we were earning like $7.25 at the time, as in like a kind of a stasis mode, like training.
Right.
So we're training. I'm bartending and doing other things to get extra money. And then the restaurant opens. And I would say my first night on the floor was a pretty much complete flame out. It was really bad. I had all the VIPs in my section. Okay. We were only serving 2 wines, but somebody wanted a celebrity came in that was in my section, and the chef decided instead of giving them the friends and family meal, they were going to do a 10-course tasting menu. But we only had 2 wines for friends and family, a white and a red. And they said, we want to do wine pairings. And I thought, well, I only have 2 wines. And so I tracked down Josh and I said, what do I do? I only have 2 wines. He goes, just like, make it exciting, make it fresh every time. And I really just didn't know what to do. And so for the first 5 courses, I brought over the same white wine, and I'd be like, and once again, we have the, and it was so embarrassing and so bad. Anyway, at the end of the first week, Josh was tasked with firing sort of half the people that he hired because he just, hired too many bartenders, too many sommeliers. And so I hit the cutting room floor. And what the nice thing about that is that at that moment, Veritas was looking for a new sommelier, because that was the moment Patrick Cappiello left Veritas to go take over. Oh God, what was that place called?
In Midtown, in the Helmsley building or something? Gilt or something?
Yeah, Gilt. Thank you. Gilt, yeah. So Patrick left Veritas to Gilt, and they were looking for a new sommelier. And the nice thing about Veritas and Tim Kopech is that he specifically likes to hire untrained sommeliers to train them up himself. And, though I had this like kind of sort of micro experience with the Oak Room, it really wasn't particularly substantial. So they ended up hiring me, and I was the first female sommelier that Veritas had ever had in its 10 years. And at first I worked with, Tim and Yoshi Takamura, and then Tim left, and then Ruben Sanz Ramiro, and later Alex Cubbage joined, and a guy named Matt Kruger was there briefly. I mean, it was amazing. And Veritas was incredible. I mean, that wine list was insane.
Who was the chef there?
So the time when I was the chef there, the time when I was working there, Gregory Pougin was the chef, and he was
somebody else came in. Yeah.
So I wasn't there for, the Anthony Bourdain days. I wasn't there, I wasn't there for a lot of the foundational Veritas time. But I came later, and it was.
I bumped into Tim at the Grand Cru Selection wine tasting. I think it was a week or 2 ago. So, and he's very close to another friend of mine. They're golf buddies. I said, Tim, I have Kelli White coming on in a week or so. He goes, oh, Kelli. He goes, she's one of the smartest people I ever met.
Oh.
I go, no kidding. She was a neuroscientist. And that's when he told me, you know what I loved about Kelly? I hired her with no experience, and my shtick was I wanted to bring in people. And he told me the same story you told me,
Oh,
which kind of is a cool thing. He was able to pull it off because I guess he was willing to invest the time. All right, so you leave Veritas. What
yeah.
happens?
Well, so I left Veritas to move to California. So
For a
at this point
job or a desire?
well, a mix of things. So at this point in time, I had met and started dating the man who would become my husband, and he was a sommelier, and he opened a wine bar in the Time Warner Center that had all this like crazy build out, really big budget, lots of momentum. They opened the week the market crashed. And
Wait, Time
so,
Warner Center in New York?
yeah, right outside of Per Se. So it was called
Yeah,
Clo
yeah,
Wine.
the
Yeah,
by Columbus Circle.
exactly. Yeah, it was called Clo Wine Bar, and they opened up that exact week. And so,
Oh boy.
Scott got another job. He bounced around a little bit, but he was at Gordon Ramsay maybe for a while. Anyway, that was, I think, a bit of a body blow to him. And, in the New York, in the immediate aftermath of the housing market crash, a lot of sommeliers left, like a lot of restaurants closed, a lot of wine lists shrank. This is like when Hong Kong
Yes.
was starting to really attract a lot of the big talent. They had just dropped their sin tax, and a lot of high profile wine people were moving to Asia and Hong Kong. They were just seemed like a bleak time to be in New York in a luxury good business. But I
Right.
wanted to stick it out at Veritas for a couple of years for obvious reasons, just access to those wines. And so I said, give me 2 years. I want to stay at Veritas for a while. And so he lumped along, but he was ready to do something else. He wanted to learn how to make wine. And so we started to put out feelers to move to wine country somewhere and get out of New York, and almost moved to the Mosel. But then we got an opportunity in Napa Valley. So Press Restaurant is still owned by the Rudd family. But
Right.
back then
Leslie Rudd.
back then it was Leslie, and unfortunately Leslie's no longer with us,
Right.
but back then it was owned by Leslie Rudd. And he knew Scott. He and I had not met, but he had massive respect for Veritas. And so all he needed to hear was that that's where I worked. And he was like, okay, I'm sure she's fine. And he effectively offered us a job. But because Scott wanted to learn how to make wine, we didn't want to each like work full time. We didn't want to have crazy restaurant hours. We wanted to be able to cultivate other interests, but we needed jobs. We couldn't just go there and not work. So we couldn't just move to some obscure wine region and not work and just study winemaking. We needed to work, but we didn't want to work, full time. So Leslie let us share the wine directorship at Press.
Oh
And
wow.
then my husband and I started a little wine brand called Houndstooth the next year. So we moved in 2010 and started Houndstooth in 2011. And during this time, I'm decided to write the book on Napa. And so that started to take more and more of my time. So I'm sort of fading off the floor at Press, even though I was very much a part of building that wine list. And the tasting notes in the book are based on the cellar there. That started to become more of Scott's baby. He's building Houndstooth and sort of taking over Press. I'm writing articles that are getting traction. And my book comes out in 2015. And at that point in time, that's right around the time that I fully, left the floor and I went to work for Galoni at Venice when Venice was brand new. This was just
Right.
newly launched. So it was one of their first employees. And I did
Did
that.
you feel good about it, as a startup? Or it was
Yeah, I
just
mean,
a
I think,
job and you took a shot?
well, quite
Little of
frankly,
both.
there was a lot of things. I approached Antonio because he was at Press. Because when he took over for Robert Parker,
Yeah.
interestingly, Robert Parker was really close friends with the owners of Veritas, and so he was in there all the time doing stuff with Park Smith. And then randomly, Press was sort of his preferred event venue in Napa. And so when I first moved to Press, Robert Parker's still at Robert Parker, the Advocate, rather, and did events at Press. So I stayed in touch with him. But then first Antonio took over for Robert Parker when he retired, right? So now
Right.
Antonio is doing events at press for the Advocate. And so that's where I got to know Antonio. And then when it was announced, or when there were rumors that he was starting Venice, I said to him, I'd love to throw my hat in the ring. And I had been writing about wine almost, my entire career, but most of it was for free or for very, very little. And I
Right.
didn't really think that it was something that would pay. And, I've always been maybe too practical, too cowardly to like scrap it together as a freelancer. And I really respect those that do. I want like a salary, I want benefits and a salary. And that's always been important to me. So I didn't think that a full-time salaried position in wine writing, quite frankly, was really possible. It seemed like there was so few of them. And so I was really excited to go and work for a publication and I get a salary, although, certainly a modest one,
Right.
and do that for a living. That was the dream. I didn't think it was possible.
What, he brings in people to do specific things. What were you tasked to do when you got there?
So in the beginning, it was a much more of a support role. Um, and I did a lot of like editorial help, putting things up on the website, helping with the merger with Stephen Tanzer's publication, just
Right.
kind of getting the databases to speak to each other. And I did some writing, but it was more, kind of narrative driven profiles of people, restaurants, things like that. So I was doing some writing, but more support work. And then towards the end of my time there, I was offered a bigger role to do like actual review and criticism and write tasting notes and scores. And this was a very important moment for me because on the one hand, I thought, I love wine writing. I love to write about wine. This feels like I should say yes. But on the other side of the coin, I realized and think in the little kind of toe dip that I had in it at my time at Venice, that as much as I love writing about wine, I do not love writing tasting notes, and giving numerical scores to wine makes me uncomfortable. And it's not that I don't think they're valuable and that people
No,
should
I
do them.
totally get it.
It just,
I mean,
for me, it was something that was very hard for me to do.
and I think people look towards Venice mostly to get the lowdown on the wines and find a store. I mean, a score. There's a lot of writing and wraparound and depth, but I think people like, what did Galoni give this wine type thing.
Yeah, and that's
I think people still feel that way. Although I find myself going there more for the articles than the scores. So
listen, I think that there's something for everybody, and I think that's something I talk about in my book a lot, and that scores are a really helpful shortcut for people that either, aren't comfortable with a lot of wines and just want, some easy help, or don't have a lot of time to think about it. They're very, very useful, but, that can be the stepping stone to, when you have a little bit more time, reading the articles in depth and actually, reading the vintage guides and the regional guides and the producer
I think
profiles.
that's healthy advice for how to look at scores. I mean, I appreciate, the way you set that up. All right. So I want to move along because there's a ton of subjects. So Venice, how long
2
were you
years.
there? Okay. Then what?
Then I left to write for Guildsom, and that was, I was there for about 2.5 years, and I did, very long form, very academic writing, which I loved. A lot of teaching for the members of the trade, which was great. And then I left to take the job that I have now. And I've been here for the last 5 years.
And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. I just want to tap into you a little on Napa because, you sort of embedded yourself there, at press and in the wine scene. What was going on in Napa in 2010? I mean, was cab was king? Was it all this big over extracted cab? Was that really the feature of the list there? Was there other California stuff?
Well, I think that, the idea of Napa just being big over extracted cab is something that is not true of the region, but is true of a lot of people's perception of the region. It was
wait. Maybe now, but what about then? You're defending then that it was more than that?
Well, look, Let me finish the thought, because I think, that was also the perception that I was coming into Napa with in 2010. So, and I've said this many times, that I was moved here very reluctantly. I moved here because we were offered a job that made living in wine country financially possible. But I was like, well, Napa wouldn't have necessarily been my first choice, because the wines that I had been exposed to in New York, for the most part, the ones that I could afford anyway, were sort of not necessarily to my taste. And so I had this very narrow idea of what Napa Valley was. And then I got here and I started living here. And 2010 is a really interesting moment in Napa history for a number of reasons. So one,
It was a
with
good
my
vintage.
what?
It was a good vintage.
Well, yes, it was a very good vintage. So there's that. Then the other thing that was happening that was really interesting is that with the wine list, my husband and I zeroed in right away on older vintages. And that was something that just very few people had any appreciation for, including a lot of the locals. This idea that the old school Napa wines could age so well. And so we got really, really into that. And so immediately my appreciation of Napa Valley and what it was capable of split wide open, because we were experiencing, how gorgeous these old wines could age. And it put the contemporary ones, in a more firm context for me. Meanwhile, 2010 is arguably the beginning of the kind of new California movement, right? John
Right.
Bonet wrote about this a lot. And there was a whole new generation of vintner in California, not so much in Napa, but here too,
Right.
that were experimenting and playing and trying new things. And like the natural wine movement was sort of very fringe in the background, picking up speed, but like that was here a little bit too, with wineries like Scholium Project and stuff. So there was just a lot of range. And then you had Robert Parker retiring, and I think that was like 2011. And then so Antonio Galloni stepped into Robert Parker's shoes. But at that moment, that was kind of the beginning of what felt to me like wine media becoming really fractionalized in a good way, where instead of just two really dominant voices of like Jim Laube and Robert Parker, however you feel about those two people, what they contributed was important and meaningful. Now you had all of these other writers starting their own gigs that are now, well established. Like now you've got Lisa Parati Brown and Jeb Dunnick, doing their own thing, and obviously Venice and a
So
bunch
did
of others.
to you, does that democratize wine coverage, wine criticism? I mean, that's a good thing to you?
It's a very good thing, because I think while on a certain surface level, you might think, okay, if you have now suddenly dozens of people and publications giving scores, maybe that creates confusion for the consumer, because they're like, well, maybe it was easier when there were two people to listen to, right? So that's potentially true. But on the other hand, I think, the reality is that we can pretend that wine criticism is completely objective. And I think that wine critics work really hard to make it objective. And I think that but like any creative interpretation, whether it's fine art or music critics or even restaurant critics, right, where you're assessing something that is, creative and complex and personal, there's going to be some subjectivity involved. And you can tell this by just looking at the fact that a single wine will get different scores from different publications, right? I think statistically, when you back that data out, it's very useful to see the ones that are like, there's general consensus that, okay, these producers are great, or this vintage was great, or these wines are great. That's
Right.
interesting on a macro level and really informative. But when you zoom in and you look at one individual wine getting different ratings from different reviewers, that's, I think, useful to the consumer. Because let's say that you are just learning about wine and you like a particular wine, you find it however you find it, a sommelier, a wine shop, randomly, somebody gives it to you, whatever it is. You open this wine and you think, this is the wine for me. I found my wine. I really like it. I'm interested to know how it scored. And then you see that one person gave it 96 points and one person gave it 92 points. I think it's a reasonable takeaway to say, hey, maybe the person that gave this wine that I know that I like the higher score has a palate that's similar to
Right, is
mine.
my
I
guy,
wonder what
right.
else that person likes.
That
And
that
so,
goes with importers and distributors too, which we'll also talk about later.
yeah,
If you
exactly. And
like
so
a Kermit Lynch wine, you'll probably like his other wines, that he
yeah,
brings in.
and it all comes down to an editorial point of view. And there are certainly some importers and distributors that are just bringing in everything. They want to hit all the notes, and that's less informative maybe. But if you find a wine that has like a specific importer or distributor, if that's visible to you, that has been given a score by a person or writer that has a specific point of view, that's something to lock into, and that can become a very useful um, guide in your wine journey. And I think
I
that
agree.
so I tried to sort of lay all these different paths and avenues out for somebody that was trying to navigate this world of wine purchasing, especially if they're doing it via wine writing and wine criticism.
So the internet opened up a lot for what we just discussed. As an extension of the internet, social media blew up. And that's same and different in many ways than what we just talked about. I want to talk to you about two things.
Sure.
Um, criticism and review went from, one or two, three, a handful of people to being more democratized, as you mentioned, um, which gave people a lot of opportunities. With social media, there's just this flow of information, anything from the most credible Psalm posting stuff, to some know nothing bottle shot guy or whatever. Um, where do you, that's the first thing. The second thing is there's a good aspect of peer to peer um, wine coverage. Like, I don't know if it's like Vivino or whatever, where people, the participants, not the reviewers, kind of rate the wines, and you get this peer type of thing. How do you see social media and its effects, on wine?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been really interesting to watch because, I saw the whole thing happen where all of a sudden, sommelier went from kind of an unknown profession to maybe kind of a hip one. And then, usually through social media, you had sommeliers kind of moving markets, to an extent, in that
I
they would get
totally
really
agree.
bullish on, whether it's Barolo or Northern Rhone or, Burgundy. And you would see prices rise accordingly, starting in the aftermarkets and then sort of trickling. So that was really interesting to watch, that kind of shift from the classic wine writing model being the dominant mode of influence and power to sommeliers sharing that. And then now you have, influencers and crowd sharing or crowdsourced wine reviews and things like that. And, I'm old enough. I've been in the wine industry now almost 25 years. I'm old enough that a lot of my peers are like, we sound, can sound like grouchy old men being like, oh,
Right.
grumble about, this app or that influencer or whatever. And I have been very fortunate in my career to spend a lot of time with consumers, and a lot of consumers at the beginning of their wine journey. And I really try not to grumble or dismiss or be judgmental about any new way of wine communication, because that's just another way to reach another population of people. There's a
I'm
lot.
with you on that. And there's going to
Yeah,
be good and there's going to be bad. You sift out, like you said earlier, you lean towards that reviewer or that, poster that is more in line to what your interests are, right?
exactly. And I think I've spent a grand total of 5 minutes on TikTok. I am just not like digital native enough for that to speak to me. But I know that there are a lot of people for whom that is going to be the way they receive their
Right.
wine information and
You have to be
education.
open minded to that. And any way you
Exactly.
could spread the gospel, if it's TikTok, that's good. Kelly, we have to take a quick break.
Sure.
When we come back, I want to spend time talking about Wine Confident. We're
Okay.
talking to Kelli White. Kelli is going to talk to us when we come back about our new book, Wine Confident. You're listening to The Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. All right, we're back. We're back with my guest, Kelli White. Kelli just wrote a new book called Wine Confident. I told you offline that I think the book is spectacular. The depth and the detail is amazing. It's really an incredible guide. It covers so many subjects and topics. And, like I said, the depth, is just crazy. And it's very approachable. Maybe some people got the impression you're some smarty and maybe a little nerdy. None of that. There's none of that feel in the book because you and I know wine can get pretty nerdy. So the
Yeah.
leading question to the book is, and don't be too long-winded on this, but you had mentioned somewhere when you wrote your Napa Valley book, you wrote the book that you needed, to get you the information and the answers and lay it out, the way you want. Did you write this book for similar reasons, or?
Well, here's my answer to that. And feel free to bang the gong if it goes too long.
All
But
right.
my feeling is that, I'm not so special, right? So if I have a question about something, that means probably thousands of other people have had that same thought or question. And so, again, I've been working in a teaching capacity for most of my career, and now that's my full-time focus. So I hear these same questions over and over again, very specific things like, how do you begin to order wine in a restaurant? I'm so intimidated. Or how do you know when to open a wine? Or why do you decant and for how long and when? And, those are just a couple of examples of.
I was just going to say that in the book, and those are all so legit and like real. That's like one of thousands of things you covered in the book. That's what I'm talking about with depth. The two things you just mentioned, there's 40 wraparound associated answers and questions to that. So
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, and that's the dance I tried to do with the book was answer kind of maybe any question you might have about wine, not related to specific wine regions or grapes. We don't really get into that, but just like the basics of wine appreciation, tasting, drinking, ordering, buying, like the physical interaction with wine for most consumers. What are all the questions they might ask? And then give them, if possible, 2 levels of answers, a really quick takeaway and more information if it's wanted. Because I think that in teaching and talking to people, like people have all sorts of motivations for learning about wine, and not everybody has the same depth of interest.
Right.
And some people just want a quick answer, but sometimes a quick answer is insufficient, or they might want a quick answer now, but they might want to later kind of understand a bit more about why something is the way it is. So the dance I tried to do in the book was be like brief and punchy and hopefully funny and engaging, and say, you need to know this. This is not that important. Forget this. But then here's some more information backing all this up. Real information that's like, here's how your brain works when you're appreciating wine.
Right.
Here's the sort of very brief history of wine glasses and shapes and textures and why you shouldn't overthink these selections. Like, people have not been drinking wine from vessels like these for thousands of years. Like, this is a modern thing. It's
Right.
okay to
and
relax.
those have evolved. Yeah.
Yeah. These are different ways to think about wine and food pairing. But again, like, is there really a high risk proposition? Is anybody going to storm out of your house if you flub this? Like, trying to reduce anxiety and give supporting information were the sort of twin goals of the book.
So wine invokes so much fear and the unknown to us, because it's that type of subject matter. I mean, just people just feel so uninformed, or it seems so difficult. I mean, do you think wine is that much of a topic, and the approach to the book really chips away at that, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think part of the reason why people fear wine is because not wine knowledge and wine appreciation is really bound up with notions like class, with like privilege, with access, with exclusivity,
That's a whole nother
sophistication.
show. You're right.
Yeah, so there's this sort of like there's this vulnerability of wine. Like if I do it wrong, I'm sort of telling on myself in terms of not being sophisticated or worldly or the right born into the right socioeconomic class. And so we can pretend that that anxiety isn't there, but that's a big part of the reason why people are like freaked out about wine in a way that they're not freaked out about beer. Because I don't know when the last time you spent time with a beer geek was. It
No,
can be just as deep.
agreed.
It
My
can
my
be just
my friend Miguel de Leon calls it colonialism. He
yeah,
he
yeah.
he wrote us an article about it, but it addresses everything you ticked off in that sense. It definitely has a certain history and vibe to it. Let me get some vitals away on the book.
Sure.
When did you decide to first write the book?
I was approached to write it
You
last
were
summer. Yeah, the publisher reached out to me.
said, "Why don't you do a book like this?"
Yeah, and they specifically said, we don't want your like long-winded academic voice. We want your, Kelly White, self-deprecating, kind of corny joke voice. So I said, "Are you sure?"
Um,
And they said, "That's what we want." Oh,
I think you've succeeded. Are you satisfied based
Oh,
on that
I'm
request?
really, yeah, I'm super proud of this book. And what's funny is that I never thought I would write a second book. And if I did, I imagined it would be another specialty topic. I had zero um impetus to write a beginner wine book. I thought I'm like, oh, I'm like a wine, but I'm an academic, right? So at first I was sort of taken aback by the thing, but then as I started writing this, I thought this is actually the most important work I'll probably ever do, because these basic questions, even though granted, like there's a lot of intro to wine books out there and some of them are extraordinary. There's still,
Oh, wait.
all,
So stay on that vein, because I have a
yeah,
very specific question.
sure.
You kind of set me. So here was the question, and it leads right into what you said. And what I was going to ask you is there's a bunch of books out there already. Books like Aldo Soames' Wine Simple. Ray
Yeah.
Isle just wrote a book, The World in a Wine Glass.
Oh, good.
Karen McNeil's Wine Bible maybe
Iconic.
approaches it. So I think you were getting to this, but how is your book different? This isn't a book about varietals and regions. It's not just what glass to. How is it different than a lot of these books that are out there from good people?
So, in a sense, it's probably most similar to Aldo Soames' book in a lot of ways, because we both, especially the publisher, the way they sort of pitched it to me is they said, we want this to be like a sommelier's guide to wine. And we want as many personal stories as you like. The nice thing about my career, which never really felt like necessarily a nice thing before, like in my sort of darkest moments of self doubt, I would accuse myself of being kind of a dilettante or non-focused in my angle. I've worked in wine exclusively for 25 years, but as you and I have gone through, I've done so many different things, like retail, sales,
Right.
making it, writing about it, like teaching, all this stuff. And for a long time, I felt like, okay, that's makes my resume look weird. Like, would I hire me? But I think it was a real strength in this book because I have come at this subject from every professional angle. And I have worked both in educating the trade and in educating the consumer. And so I made it really personal. And that's the thing that, in today's day where there's almost too much information available, right? The most, I think Adam Grant, I'm not trying to like plagiarize Adam Grant. Adam Grant just put out some kind of tweet like this, but it was something like, in an era of information overload where anything is Googleable, right? Knowing the most things is no longer the most valuable skill. It's how you synthesize information and present it that is the real sort of differentiator. And so I thought, I know that I have a talent for taking really complex things and explaining them in a way that honors the complexity without alienating the reader. And I do think that's a skill that I have. And I also have a whole career of personal stories, not just of stories of people that have come to me with XYZ stories, and those are in there, but
Right.
times when I've embarrassed myself or times when I've done something the wrong way and had to rethink and regroup and come at it again. And so I put all of that in here in an effort to be vulnerable, in an effort to basically reassure the reader that if you're finding this thing difficult, or if you are finding this thing alienating, or if you can't connect to X, you're not alone. And
Right.
there's value in pushing through that. And here's how I got through it. And here's, how some other people dealt with, XYZ. And here's some information that might support you, on your journey. Because I think that fundamentally, this wine thing is really worth it. It's really fun. It's a wonderful way to connect with people. It's absolutely delicious. There's just nothing better than a great bottle of wine.
I
And it's
also
yeah.
I think that, part of the answer that was so impressive to me is, why is this book different? Is the book is different because of who I am, what I've done, where I've come from, how diversified that has been, my personality, my intellect and all of that. I mean, that is all an important part of the book instead of just writing about all these, facts and things and all of that. I think that's what makes the book awesome and gives it that personality.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I
Which is
appreciate it.
why, I think it is different. Um, I know I interrupted you. I didn't mean
No,
to.
no, no, no. Please do.
So
You saw my
let's
napkin.
talk about
I'll go
let's
on.
talk about how the book is laid out, and then I want to get into specifics. The book has 9 chapters. I'm gonna tick them off because I have them in
Yeah.
front of me. These are in order: tasting wine, talking wine, buying wine, handling wine, collecting wine, understanding wine, making wine, growing wine. Um, what is it? Talking the list. Those are all the chapters, and like I said more than a couple times, the depth and detail that falls under those is crazy. Tell me, were the 9 chapters, the topics a no-brainer? Did you have to cut it down to them? There are topics within the chapters. How did you get to that? And I know that you probably should have started the book with the chapter understanding wine,
Yeah.
but you jump right into tasting.
Yeah, that was my brilliant editor, Susan Keevel's idea. The original outline that I submitted when we started this process is almost exactly like what you see, with that exact change, that understanding wine was in the beginning. And understanding wine is the part of the book where we get into like wine's history and how it spread around the world and all that stuff, like fundamentals, like what is vitis vinifera, like that kind of stuff.
Right.
So I thought that was obviously where we needed to start. And then Susan read the table of contents when we were first starting, and she said, I think let's start with like an action item. Let's start with drinking. And I thought, oh, so I shuffled some things around. But I mean, that was writing that table of contents
I think she was
was really
right.
easy. Yeah.
But did it cover? Is there anything you wanted to put in there? Is there anything you wanted to split into 2 sections? Or you pretty much nailed it with that list that I read out chapter wise?
Yeah, I mean, that was really what I wanted to cover. I wanted this by virtue of the fact of my first book being so big and so specific.
I called it a
Um,
doorstop.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted this to be very much the opposite. I wanted it to be small and friendly. I still wanted it to have, a lot of information in there and be useful, but I didn't want it to be overwrought. And so there was a moment where we were talking about brief descriptions of wine regions around the world and countries. And, as I started to get into the writing, I said, I don't want to, let's get rid of this because we don't need it. There are other books that do it better. If we
Plenty.
want to do that one day, then
Great
let's do a book that
varieties.
just does
all
that.
that.
Yeah, we do it like a little, there's like a
Yeah,
chart.
at the end you talk about it, but you don't get it. I mean, Jancis Robinson wrote a book about grapes. I mean, that's another.
Yeah, exactly.
stuff.
Now everybody's retired from that subject.
Now, is this the type of book? Let's say I go out and buy, I hear this interview. I go, wow, I need to get this. I get the book. I look at it. Can I start by skipping around to chapters, or do I need to read it cover to cover?
No, you can absolutely dip in and dip out. I mean, I'm under.
I think so, but I wanted you to, answer that. Because I think if you're like one of these anxious people and you're in this collecting mode, you go to the collecting section and you get all the answers that you want, and then you fill in the other stuff. Now, throughout the book, I want you to talk about this. Throughout the book, there are also 2, I guess I call them information boxes.
Yeah.
You call them pro tips and you call them inside track. I think one is green, one is yellow, if I'm correct. Explain why, other than writing about everything we've been talking about, you inserted, these 2 things.
So in order to make the book, I think, digestible, I wanted to have these kind of, I think of them as conversational asides, right? So, for example, the chapter on handling wine, if I were to just in a narrative format kind of talk with just paragraph, this is how you carry a wine, this is how you store it, this is how you blah, 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 because I wanted to put so much detail in there, that would have been big blocks of text that would probably be impenetrable to most like attention spans. So the side boxes became a way to sort of, in a splashy, visually interesting way, take a small idea that's like touched upon in the main text of the paragraph and expand upon it. So things like how to open a bottle with a wax top. Things like how to, why is cork tape called, how do you detect cork tape? What if the sommelier doesn't agree with you that it's corked?
Right.
If I built that into the main text would have become cumbersome. So this was just a way to sort of make it more conversational, make it more bite-sized, and make more sense in the context of our sort of modern, attention span, for lack of a better word, because it just seemed like a better chance to reach people. And then people
works.
that like don't want to know like what happens if the cork crumbles, like they're not ready for that. They're just really focused on, why do I store wine on its side? They don't have to read that one,
Good point. I mean, you're reading through the text. You don't have to read through this long thing. You could see it on the side, go to it if you want, or, come back to it, whatever, which I think works well. It makes the book, very useful in that sense. All right. So obviously I can't talk about all these 8 chapters, plus there's other information in there. But I do want to talk to you about a few things.
Okay.
Tasting wine. I have so much trouble tasting wine. I mean, my friends look to me like for descriptors, which is a whole other silly thing in wine. And they're looking for opinions, what do you think and all of that. In the tasting chapter, you talk about tasting, maybe not the way people, think about it, tasting with your 5 senses. First of all, you probably have to remind people what the 5 senses are. And what do you mean?
Oh, obviously we think about smell and taste when we taste wine, but using sight, hearing, and touch too.
That's important, right?
Yeah,
for
and they're
wine?
varying degrees of importance, but yeah, they're all in there.
All right. You also said taste with your nose, not your mouth. Pretty bold statement. I thought both, but why do you lean towards taste with the nose as the initial recommendation?
Well, what I'm trying to communicate there is that we get the majority of flavor information from our noses. Even though for complex neurological reasons, we localize taste to our mouth, right? Like you
Right.
tell me to taste an ice cream cone, I'm going to lick it, right? I'm not going to sniff it. We get most of the flavor information of things from our sense of smell. And so I go into a little bit of the neuroscience behind it, just a little bit. I really had to hold myself back from putting too much in there. But
Right.
the point that I make is that just talking about flavor, not necessarily taste, because taste is flavor plus texture and other things, but and salt and
Right.
sweet and all that stuff. But just thinking about flavor.
Right.
If you pinch your nose when you swallow a glass of wine, it'll taste like almost nothing. But the other point that I make in this beautiful post-pandemic world we're living in is that for those of you out there like me who lost your sense of smell during COVID, like food was annihilated, like flavor was gone. And to the best of my understanding, COVID doesn't affect the palate or the mouth. This was a sort of nasal issue. And so when I lost my sense of smell during COVID, first of all, it was terrifying because this is my only life skill. So I have no backup skills.
Screwed.
Um, yeah, well, but also it was very interesting to me to eat under that, with that condition, because I remember eating chicken soup and it was a textural experience and I tasted and a temperature experience and I tasted a little bit of salt. And that was it. That was just eating to survive. That wasn't
It's
there.
interesting.
All the enjoyment was stripped, and it was scary and certainly disorienting. But it was also just intellectually really interesting. So, like through my 102-degree fever, I'm like, oh, this is actually really cool.
Well,
Um,
yeah, for you, I mean, because you're so nerdy, it wound up being a cool experience. It was like an experiment,
yeah, it was. It
right?
was an experiment on myself.
Jesus. You talk about talking about wine. I always felt, tasting and describing and all. Why is it so hard to articulate? Because you can't get your hands around? Is it
Yeah, it's
everything we
tough.
just talked about?
Well, part of the problem is that wine is so complex, and like that sounds, aggrandizing, but it's true. It's one of the most, if not the most, aromatically complex comestible, and it's abstract, right? The things that it smells of, the tangible objects we might reference when describing wine, it's not like a soup. You don't
Or an
see
orange?
mushrooms floating in there, right?
Yeah,
So you don't have like the visual aid, you don't have the
you have
knowledge of
nothing.
like, right. So
Purple.
you're fumbling around in the dark, and you can train yourself to get better at picking out these individual scents, but it's complicated, and our own neurological wiring sort of fights against us in that. And so I go into that a little bit, but more importantly, the point that I make is actually a legacy of something that Eric Asimov kind of woke up in me when he wrote his book years ago, How to Love Wine. I went to see him do like a book talk, and it was so crazy to me that an established wine writer was sort of speaking out against the tasting note. I thought, is this allowed? Is he going to get arrested? I thought we
Ah,
were all on board with these
wow.
tasting notes in this format. And his point was like, this is not how he likes to talk about and communicate about wine. And for reasons that you and I have already discussed, that obviously resonated with me. And now, fast forward, I'm working with consumers on a daily basis with a varying degree of knowledge. And I tell the story in the book of this woman that came to me and she wants to learn to be a better taster. But she said she just went to a winery in Napa. And the poor, like I'm sure very well meaning host of the tasting experience asked what they thought was a harmless question, which was, what do you taste in this wine? And the response this woman felt was not like, an excitement to engage. It was terror because she had a really hard time. She has a really hard time picking out specific smells from an abstract glass of wine, which is again a hard thing to do, easier for some than others. And she felt really put on the spot. She felt embarrassed, and her emotional response was to withdraw and retreat. And what she said to me was like, "I guess I just can't taste wine like other people. I guess it's not for me. I don't get it."
No.
And that's just because like she struggled with this idea of naming the fruits that are in the wine.
Right.
And I think the longer the wine industry persists in sort of putting out there that is the best and or only way to enjoy or express what they're tasting in wine, we run the risk of alienating a massive amount of people.
I
And
agree.
so,
And I think shelf cards still, sort of reflect that.
yeah, and I
Shelf
think again,
talkers,
like
it's
I'm a
all
def-
those descriptive
yeah,
stuff.
I'm a defender of that too. I mean, I think that's really useful to a lot of people, but that's not the only way to talk about wine. And
No.
I think that, so I bring in some like instances of poetry. I actually quote Miguel, who you mentioned, talking about a wine that made him feel like the little spoon and things like that, that are like a little bit less kind of grocery list and a little bit more emotional. Because if anyone is buying and reading a wine book or listening to a wine podcast, chances are they're already invested in this idea that wine elicits an emotional response.
Agree.
And
Agree.
so then to say, okay, that's fine. You can feel those feelings, but now we want you to turn all that off and describe wine in an incredibly clinical and precise way. That feels like a big disconnect to me. I think it's okay to encourage people to use creativity and emotion to describe wine. And I actually think it might even sometimes be more universally understandable and perhaps even a better way to describe to somebody what you like in the terms of a sommelier perspective.
Well, we were talking off air. My friend Gary Vaynerchuk kind of did that many years ago. He was unconventional and made that more approachable. And I think that's why he won over followers and brought, new people into wine, because he got away from all the convention.
Yeah, and I grew up, he was at his height when I was just coming up in wine in the early 2000s, and I'm sure that was very influential to a part of the way that I developed an appreciation for wine. But I also
Yeah.
think that, a lot of Americans are in this boat, but I came to wine as an outsider and I struggled with that insecurity for a really long time. And now I'm 25 years in and I'm thinking like, no, actually being an outsider to wine is really valuable. It's a really good perspective. And, we're, and so the book is maybe written for the outsiders, the people that didn't grow up with parents that were walking them through, how to taste great old Bordeaux, and they didn't inherit
I
a
think
cellar.
that may be the majority of people. So that's a good
It's
spot.
100%. Yeah, the majority of people.
All right, I
Absolutely.
want to broach on a few more chapters and topics. I think this one is important. You do a chapter on buying wine, and I think the buying wine applies to making retail purchases, walking into a store, and even probably harder and more importantly is selecting a wine in a restaurant with a som standing over you or your friends staring at you. Um, Psalms can be intimidating. You know very much about that. You have a very specific view on it. Walking into a wine store, whether somebody's on top of you to help you, or it's like a Home Depot where you have to search around for somebody to help you. That could be similar. Talk about your thoughts, which you write in the book, about handling and overcoming this. Because people, if they have an interest in wine, they should walk into a restaurant, know how to handle it and be comfortable. And if they go into a store, they should know how to, maneuver that. And a lot of times it points to the same thing, which hopefully you'll talk about.
Yeah. So the advice that I give in the book is, to if you're trying to figure out what you like and what you want, which a lot of people have a hard time figuring out, right? That it's better to be slightly methodical than to just throw a dart at the dartboard every single time. And so the
Right.
advice that I give is to, especially if you don't have somebody specifically helping you, is to just take one step into the unknown. And so by which I mean, let's say that you last night had an Argentine Malbec that you really liked, right? And you're now in a restaurant or you're in a wine shop and you don't want that exact wine or they don't have it, but you want to learn, you want to play. So taking one step away from that wine might be trying another Malbec from a different producer or a Malbec from a different country or a different wine from that producer or a different wine from that region or just something else. Start to explore that country or use it as a jumping off point, and then you can kind of start to walk a path. And if you say, let's say to use this Argentina example, like you say, I loved this Malbec. I've had a bunch of things from Argentina. Maybe I really like wines from Argentina. I'm going to play around in here for a while. And then you taste a Torrontés and you think, oh, that's not it. I don't like that. That's too floral. So you walk back from that and you turn around the other direction and be like, okay, let's explore other red wines from Chile, from South America. Let's expand. Let's both narrow it. We're going to take out floral white wines and we're going to expand to include red wines from other countries in South America. So you can be a little methodical in your exploration so that it's just not so overwhelming, right?
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
That's great advice. But fill in one thing for me.
Yeah.
Let's say this is at a store or a restaurant. You're relying on the expert, the store owner, one of the somms. How do you, before even getting to that point, how do you get through that intimidation thing? Like, oh, this guy's going to tell me he's going to overcharge me. He's going to give me what he wants, not what I like. The end result is what you just described. How do you make sure we get there?
Yeah. So specifically about sommeliers, I think that there's a couple of things to keep in mind. And one is that they're there to work for you. Right. So I talked to a woman that I mentioned in the book who said she didn't ever want to talk to sommeliers because she didn't want them to know that she didn't know anything about wine. So that's obviously
That's the whole
like
point.
very understandable, but also like, oh my God, what are we even doing here? Like that's effectively your employee for the night, right? Like this person is here to help you make that decision. So first of all, don't be intimidated, engage them. But then I would say be really specific, because one of the things that, as I worked as a sommelier that I would see a lot was like a lot of wishy-washiness in terms of not wanting to be really firm about what price that you wanted because maybe you didn't want to seem cheap, or you didn't want to
Right. Those
sort
are
of
all.
announce your budget to the table or for whatever reason. But you're putting the sommelier in a really awkward position, because if you don't tell me what you want to spend and you make me guess, I'm wasting too many options in our limited time together trying to zero in on price point. And I run the risk also of offending you in both directions, either by suggesting something that's like way more than you want or way less than you're used to spending. So even if you don't have to say a number out loud, but even if you just point to a price on the wine list and be like,
There you go.
either like right around here, or this is my absolute ceiling. Now we don't have to ever talk about that again. And I have a very specific framework. The other piece of specific advice I give was, because of everything that we've already discussed about talking about wine flavors is really hard, especially if you don't know the other person and you don't, know their palate. It's kind of a tough conversation to nail. And so instead of being like, well, I want something, spicy or whatever,
Right.
you give a specific
Smooth.
example. Like show them a picture on your phone. I had this the other night. It blew my mind. Do you have
Ah.
anything like this, but that costs X? And then be open-minded and give honest feedback. And
So it doesn't hurt to do a little work,
yeah,
and be expressive. Point out what you like or what you'd like. Right. I mean, communicate.
exactly. And I think, hopefully the sommelier that you have, you know, is really good at hospitality, because and they make you feel heard and understood and taken care of,
Right.
and honor your budget and your tastes, and aren't trying to foist anything on you. So the sommelier position is a wine that tracks a lot of wine geeks, but it is fundamentally a hospitality position. And
I
so
think I think the wine world, as far as Psalms, is moving towards helping people and understanding what people want than being snotty and trying to upsell or push their likes. I think it's better out there now. Do you agree?
I mean, I think it's always going to be mixed. I think
No, definitely mixed, but not
yeah.
as bad as what I'm saying.
I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're right.
I hope I'm right.
I hope you're right. I'm sure you're right. I mean, I had some really obviously the whole like reason I'm in wine today is effectively because a really good sommelier sort of saw into my
Right.
soul and
They're
found me
there.
my perfect wine. So that happened, in 2001. So that was not yesterday. And I recently had a really bad experience where I went, I went into a restaurant and I mentioned this in the book where I don't know a lot about natural wine. It's an area in wine where I feel very kind of uncomfortable, like an outsider. I don't speak the language. I don't know it. And I went to a wine
Well, no,
restaurant.
wait, let's get very specific because
Yeah.
this is an area I wanted to talk to you about, and I'm glad you brought it up. You call yourself the uncool bystander to natural wine. Okay, that's a little self deprecating. It's a little honest. I look at it as a teeny bit of a cop out, too. So, could continue your thought.
Well, I was just going to say, I found myself in a situation where I didn't know any of the wines on the wine list and I needed some sommelier assistance. And so I asked the sommelier, if I said, can you help me? I don't know a lot about these wines. I don't want anything too funky. This is what I typically like. And they more or less interrupted me and said, don't worry. If I put it on the list, it's good. And like
But
that was
now,
sort of the extent of the advice. And I thought, oh my God, that's so
you know what I would have said to you? That is I would have said, you don't want anything too funky. Well, I have a nice natural wine for you. It's actually biodynamic. It's called Romani Conti. They've been practicing these things, I don't know, for 40, 50 years. Will that work for you, madame? But your point is right. So let me ask you this.
yeah.
Is natural wine like a title or a description still, that could be misunderstood, that you still have to say, I don't want anything funky?
Well, I felt like I couldn't not talk about natural wine in the book. But I also didn't want to talk too much about it because it's not waters I swim in. And
That's
so what I
fair.
say in the book
But
that I think
can
is
you
true
go
is
ahead?
that it's a movement in wine that is undefined. So that can make it tricky. But that at its best, it emphasizes holistic farming and low intervention winemaking. And then say that a lot of quote unquote classic wines have been made in that way for a long time, but
Right.
don't necessarily self identify with that movement. And then there are wineries that do self identify with that movement, where the sort of sub thesis seems to me that we're going to intellectually challenge what the idea of deliciousness is. And we
Right.
are open minded to things that, maybe my generation might consider wine flaws. And so there's a higher tolerance potentially for things like VA and Brettanomyces and this, that, and the other thing. And that's not all of natural wine, but it's there. That's a part of it. And, so that was sort of the point I make, and that might also be a cop out explanation, but that's the
Well,
best that
no,
I.
because here, you know what you said? And I was going to ask you, you can't deny that organic, biodynamic, regenerative farming is good for the world. You can't deny low intervention, no additives, no manipulation, is good for wine.
Yeah,
And you said it, that's not just, quote, quote, natural wine. We just said Romani Conti's been making it that way, and many, many other winemakers. I think it goes back to what I said. I think it's just the title or the description people are fumbling over more than, the options like any other wines out there. All
but
right.
there's
Well,
also, let me just want to say one last thing. I mean,
go ahead.
for all of the people out there that are like me, that are like, oh, I'm kind of intimidated by natural wine. There's a whole lot of other people that are like, oh, I'm so into it, and that's the only thing I want. Do you have natural wine? Where's the natural
How
wine bar?
about how about to another subset? Do you have just orange wine?
Right.
Right? It's like
Right.
really because
Exactly, and I think that's really cool, and if that's become like a shorthand that, I really think in wine communication, like shorthands, shortcuts, these things are always going to be reductive and flawed, and I'm not talking about wine.
right.
I mean linguistically, but they're very useful for consumers, and so if there's this like big subset of consumers, especially youthful consumers, that for them, the word natural wine is like an on switch, then like rock and roll. I'm into it.
Right.
It's just not anything that I feel that I can talk about on like a really deep level other than what we just described.
I get it. I mean, listen, you cover everything, like I said, so much in depth, and you've, offered how you feel, which is pretty clear on natural wines. So I'm glad we got to talk about it. Um, I want to wrap up soon, and I want to do our wine list because, believe it or not, we've been on the line for a while and probably could stay on a little long. Tell me, before we jump into the wine list, tell me about some of the stuff you are doing and you have been doing as director of wine education at the Wine Center at Meadowood.
Sure. So I started here about 5 years ago, so right before the pandemic, which is always an
Yeah,
interesting thing.
couple of years of twiddling your thumbs, I guess.
Yeah, it was
In a
definitely,
way. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, hustling to figure out, Zoom, things.
Right.
We were all the things we were all doing. So I do private wine classes for guests of Meadowood and for members of the Napa Valley Reserve. And
Tell me
also,
what the Napa Valley Reserve is. Is that like a community? Is it
it's a private
is
wine
that the
growing
Harlan
club.
thing?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a private club, effectively. I mean, it is. It's a private club where the tie that binds is wine, and so there's a wine made at the Napa Valley Reserve that's private to the membership, and the members can be engaged in the winemaking and blending process, design their
Right.
own labels, etc. And so the people that join the club have a very high interest in wine, but a real range of knowledge. And so I'm here to, set up tastings and events and things like that. And then at Meadowood, I effectively function like a hotel amenity. Where you get like a spa menu, right? You get a
Right.
wine center menu. You can take a range of classes from like very, very, very beginner to like pretty hardcore geeky stuff. And then we also do community events, which I love. Like we do these quarterly vintner chats where we invite members of the greater wine community in Napa and occasionally Sonoma to be in conversation with each other. And we, have light bites and they're really fun, and wine dinners and
Are
things like that.
is it because of virtue of where you are and who you're working with? Is it California centric or mostly, and you open it up to other stuff, or you stick to California?
It's very based in Napa Valley because
I
we're
mean the
operating.
wines that you
Yeah,
talk and taste.
that's what I mean too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
the wine selections are very much based in Napa Valley because we're operating under the premise that probably people are visiting Napa Valley to taste these wines.
Right.
But for the bigger concept classes, like that go into history or culture or things like that, we'll bring in international examples often, and so there's a real mix, but it's very much honoring Napa, the place where we are,
Right.
place where we
Makes
live.
sense. Who's the chef at Meadowood?
Well, I think you're probably talking about the 3 Michelin star restaurant. So there was a 3 Michelin star restaurant at Meadowood that unfortunately burned down in the
Yeah,
fires.
it did. Right. That was Chris Costner.
Costco. Yep.
Costco,
Chris
right.
Costco. Yep. Who's
He
like
was a rock star, right?
oh, he's amazing. And it was really cute. I actually was texting with him last night because my 4-year-old daughter is now taking ballet that's taught by his daughter. And so
That's crazy.
I took a picture of them in their tutus and sent it to him.
Nice. All right. Anything else on the
that's effectively.
It sounds great. I'll
one-
ask you at the end if people want more info where to go on that.
Yeah, please.
And on the book and everything. But before we get to that, I have the wine list. I've asked every
Okay.
guest from show number 1 to answer these 5 questions. They're the same 5 questions I've asked to Laura Catena on the first show, to you, almost my 300th show. I post
my
them
God.
on social media. They're documented, archived. Our listeners listen to an interview like this and go, That Kelly, she's pretty cool. Let me hear what she's drinking and recommending. So that's why we do this. So here's the first question. First
Yeah.
question is, what are you drinking now? What's in your fridge? What are you doing? Because maybe seasons changing. You exploring anything? Give me a few examples.
Whoa. Okay. So what's in my fridge? What did we drink? Let me think. Because, we drink every night.
Okay.
We open up beautiful wines every night. I had a lovely white Bordeaux from Lynch Bage last
Oh,
night.
nice.
Yeah, white Bordeaux is something that I've been really experimenting with because I love Sauvignon Blanc, especially the more kind of restrained expressions. And there's a lot of great value in white
I was just going
Bordeaux.
to say the value is crazy. I mean,
Yeah,
Lynch is a really great producer and a great name, but you can go off of names, not as well known, get great quality and great value.
Smith Oat Feet. Yeah, I mean, there's some white Bordeaux that are really budget friendly and very tasty.
All right. Anything else?
Let's see, that's what we drank the other night. And then we also drank some Pinot Noir from Matt Taylor Wines the other day,
Matt
which was
Taylor?
great. Yeah, Matt Taylor. He's based in Napa and Sonoma. His day
Okay.
job is he's the winemaker at Ink Grade, which is one of the Greater Heights
Right.
properties. But he has his
Didn't
own
like
project.
Behrens and Hitchcock make like an ink grade bottling? Is that the same thing?
No, I don't think. Well, maybe. I'm
Maybe.
not totally sure. But Ink Grade, it was a big vineyard that Heights owned, and so when Heights was still owned by Heights, they did a kind of
Yeah, maybe.
kooky port projects and things from there. Anyway, now that it's been under new ownership, they have spun that vineyard off into its own brand.
And the bottling is the label is Matt Taylor?
The Sonoma
Or
stuff that he does, the Sonoma Pinot
is
Noir that he
Matt
does.
Taylor wine or something? It's
Uh-huh.
under Matt. Okay. All
Yeah.
right, those are good. You should be pretty good at this. This may be the goofiest question, but I ask everyone to tell me their favorite wine and food pairing. Not what you and I think is the ultimate, but what do you like? Obviously, you
Well,
don't eat it all the time, but what works for you?
oh God, I'm so it's maybe a little bit boring, but I can't help but speak to my roots. So I love a good creamy clam chowder, which was
Okay, I like that.
not,
Not believe me, that's not a common answer. Go ahead. What goes with it?
and like the meanest, nastiest, and by nasty I mean just like harsh, like bright, like enamel removing Blanc de Blanc champagne you could find. Like
What's an
zero
example?
Oh, like Tarlon zero dosage.
Okay.
Like something just a real like Brut Nature, like a very bright, like cold vintage Blanc de Blanc champagne.
That's
And
a great, I love that answer. I
clam
forgot to
chowder.
tell you, we have a rule on the Grape Nation. You're not allowed to say champagne and oysters because that's like the
Oh,
quintessential. But you came up with kind of the New England poor man's, the chowder and champagne. All right, that's a good one. I think you can handle this one, and I'm going to ask
oh,
you. And no, it's not a matter of what's number one, two, or three, or ranking them or leaving people out. But tell me some of your favorite wine restaurants and or bars, only under the context that the lists are great, the people are great, the knowledge is great, the vibe is great. And if press didn't fall under every one of those categories, I don't know what did. So it doesn't have to be, I wouldn't say press is the fanciest restaurant, but it's a high-end restaurant. Give me a few places, and it could be anywhere in your travels, at home, in New
oh,
York, on the road. Who does it right?
oh boy. Well, I
And
will say
again,
that
if you say something and a friend says, "How come you didn't mention me?"
I
Because
know this is
Sam
the
told me to
problem when you
just
have
give me
friends with
some
restaurants.
examples, not random.
When you have friends with restaurants, this is so stressful. Okay, so well, um,
I'm going to help you with this. Okay,
yeah.
I'm going to help you with this because it's somebody we both know and love.
Oh, okay. Please tell.
Pascaline Lepeltier at
Oh my
Chambers
gosh,
checks
the
every
best.
one of those boxes. The
So I
food is
haven't.
great. She's a
Yeah.
rock star. The list is off the charts. The vibe is unbelievable. So something like that.
Well, so I haven't been to visit Pascaline's at Chambers yet, but I'm coming soon, and we're going to do an event together, and I'm really excited.
Right.
I recently went to this really weird little part of California called Livermore.
Okay.
And there's a Chinese restaurant in Livermore called Uncle Yu's. And it has an extraordinary wine list, like crazy stuff. I can't even remember the name of the bottle that we
Wow.
chose now,
That's a
but it was
first.
yeah, it was some kind of like crazy own rooted Rimoirten from the Loire. You know, they had like we didn't buy this, but they had Dom Perignon on the wine list there for like $225.
Wow.
It was a really big, and those are like the fun places, and that's something that
Isn't
I love.
Livermore like the famous lab town or something, or is that something different?
It's I'm one of these wine people that's like a little bit myopic. Livermore very well may be famous for something
I
other
think
than wine.
the
I don't know.
laboratory Livermore. I'll look that up offline. All right, give me one more. Give me something a teeny bit more traditional or as interesting.
A teeny bit more traditional. Well, I mean, one of my favorite places to eat in the whole world is Mock Cuisine in Beaune, in
Okay.
Burgundy. When you get there, great wines. I'm always there with great people. I traveled there for mine and a friend's birthday a couple years ago, and we just took over this huge table with a bunch of friends and ordered a bunch of wonderful
I don't know
Burgundy, and
if
that was
anyone has ever mentioned
delightful.
that restaurant, so I'm glad you brought that up. Beaune has a
Yeah.
lot of restaurants, but not millions, like San Fran or New York. All right, we'll take those two. And like I said, I
Okay.
post them. Fourth question.
Yeah.
Here's the question. Kelly White's favorite all-time wine. Now,
Oh,
hold on for a second. So when I asked this question, and this would have been good for you because you've been around this stuff like no one else. Kelly, what's the most expensive rare wine you ever tasted? I don't give a crap about that anymore. Aldo Sohm actually said, "Why are you asking me that? It's a number in a wine. That's not." The question now is, in all your travels, what's that one wine or a few that changed the way you think about wine, that was transcendental, that you still remember or think about, that's important to you? Is there a wine in your travels that you could pull out of the air that checks
yeah.
that box?
So one of the first wines that ever, really like, I'm sure you've had wines like this where they just sort of stop time, and just change your whole perspective on what greatness is.
Yeah.
For me, it was when I was working at Veritas, and I'll never forget this night because it was so snowy in New York to the point that the restaurant almost closed, like almost all the tables canceled. I was the only sommelier on staff, and I was really green. I had just
It's a
started,
good
and
story so far.
yeah, it's a great story. And these two random guys and because they didn't have a reservation, I have no idea who they were. These two random guys sit down and they order a bottle of 1985 Henri Jaillet Cros Two.
Oh boy.
And what was so scary about that wine is, it's my first night working alone at Veritas. And I had to go get that wine, and I was nervous to touch it because it was the most expensive thing I could even
Do you
think about.
remember the ballpark of the price?
I do. It was around $5,000 on the wine list at
Holy
the time.
crap. Wow.
And my hands were shaking opening it. I was so sure I was going to get it wrong. And at that restaurant, and all the restaurants that I've worked at, and I talk about this in the book too. The sommeliers would always taste the wine first, and it's not to like jump the line and drink
No,
your
I
wine.
know. There's a
Make sure
controversy to that, but there's also an answer to it.
exactly. And so I got to taste this wine first, and it's like teeny tiny sips, and time just stopped. I mean, time just stopped, and it was like seeing another dimension for the first time, or like sort of dying and then seeing something like the afterlife for a minute, and then you wake back up and you're like, wait, was that real? And so that was my only taste of that wine, and I brought it over them, and my hands were shaking pouring it too, and I just thought, that I had glimpsed something that I didn't even know was possible. And what's funny about that is like, to me, it seemed so impossibly expensive at that time at $5,000 a bottle. And I think now it's like $30,000, $40,000 a bottle.
If
Like
there's
it's
any
almost quaint
left.
how cheap it was back then. And that was my all-time favorite wine. And I just couldn't believe it. And then years later, somebody asked me this question. And at this moment in time, Scott and I, when we were buying wine at Press, we were buying a ton of wine from this one auction house. So they said, "We want to take you to lunch. What's your all-time favorite wine?" And they had, access to all this stuff. And so I told them this story, and they brought this wine to lunch, and it was corked.
Oh shit.
So I've never had more than just that one
Oh,
resplendent taste, and it changed my life. I was already committed to wine, so this was already happening, but that was like
I totally get
angels
it.
singing. Like, what was yours? What was yours? Or am
Um,
I not allowed to ask you questions?
you know what? I've never been asked back that, and I don't know the answer. And not that you're putting me on the spot, but I don't want to answer the question for the sake of answering it. I could tell you that, I've been a wine collector for a long time. I have a pretty big cellar, but I did cut my teeth on Napa wines. I
Oh,
I
great.
have verticals of Brian and Abreu and Harlan, and the list goes on and on. And some of those wines are great, and some I'm sick of, and all of that. So I would think Napa kind of set a path for me, but I don't know. I got to think. I've morphed into love Rhone wines and Barolo, blah blah blah, Burgundy. Um, but we have to remind people the Jair, he's no longer with us. The vineyard is no longer around, and whatever bottles are there, that's it. So it's really an extraordinary and an exclusive wine. All right, last question. Um, you should be able to handle this one too. Although, as much as you are for the people and make everything accessible to them, we're asking you recommend the best wine around 15, 20, 22 bucks retail. Recommend a red, recommend a white. You could go by category. Like I always say, Muscadet as a white from the right
Yeah.
producer is a great value. If somebody says, well, who, I'll say Pepier or whatever, but you can get 21 bucks of great wine. So that's what I'm looking for. And this
Yeah.
question is really a selfish one because I have kids in their late 20s, early 30s, and they don't have the money to buy $40, $50 wines for dinners or gifts. So I kind of feed them these recommendations. So give me your best shot.
Sure. Well, I've been spending over the last couple years more and more time in Spain. And I
Ah,
know it's probably a really easy answer to say Spain, but for me, there's almost no better white wine value than Albarino from Rias Baixas. Is just
see, I agree. I think, I'm not the first time, but I'm glad you brought it up and coming from you. So Spain, Albarino.
yeah.
Anything else come to mind in white?
Yeah, I mean, there's more obscure stuff, right? Like, I spent a good part of my honeymoon in the Costa Brava, so the Mediterranean coast north of Barcelona, where like El Bulli was, but we went there well after it closed.
Right.
And there were just some dry white wines from that area, like kind of Catalonia, grapes like Xarel·lo and things like that, that were really blew my mind. That can be hard to find. I love, been on a big Abruzzo kick.
Yes, me too.
Love like really fine Trebbiano, which,
Well, you can get, Emilio Pepe, but then there's stuff that's made well that's considerably less, right?
yeah, exactly. Pecorino from,
Yep.
Tiberio, and these things are really great, great,
All right,
great
so
value.
that's good on the white. Everyone tends to find the red a little harder. So give me your shot.
Yeah, red's obviously a lot more challenging. I mean, I'm
Price
inclined
wise.
price. I get it. I'm inclined to circle back to Spain. Um, you know, Drinking some beautiful garnachas. I mean, what I still find Chianti to be one of the great values in wine.
Agree. Eric
And
Asimov agrees with you.
oh, really? Well,
He
that's well.
writes articles about Chianti Classico all the time as great values. All right, so I'm going to take Garnacha. We could start with Spain. It's good value in other places too. And the Chiantis you could find in that price range from good producers. As I mentioned, we will post those answers. All
Yeah,
right,
and
Kelly,
Austria in general, but yeah.
Austria?
Yeah, Austria in general is
I
really, really.
agree. I was just at Character in Austria in May, and Marco brings it to New York this past weekend. So there were a lot of Austrian producers like Altenberger and Strohmeyer and Setmus, all these guys. There is good value there. All right, we got to wrap up. Let me do a quick wrap up, and then I need to get information from you, and then we're on our way. So if you have a question, suggestion, wine happening, or event, hit me up at sam@thegrapenation.com. That's sam@thegrapenation.com. Subscribe to the Grape Nation podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your pods. If you like the show, leave a review. If you like the show, subscribe. If you subscribe, the podcast comes to you weekly, and there you are. You wake up next to Kelli White. Not bad. Follow us on Instagram at SBenRuby, on X at BenRuby. 2 different handles, similar, but you can always use the hashtag The Grape Nation to find us on both. We're on Facebook at The Grape Nation. As I mentioned, we'll post Kelli's wine list answers on our social media sites. Kelli, give me some intel. The book is available now, we mentioned, right? Wine Confidant. Yep. Where do you point people to buy the book?
I always like to buy it direct from the publisher. So Academy Pen Wine Library.
Which is an interesting publisher compared to, even smaller boutique publishers and the big ones.
Yeah, they're
so
great.
So you go to their site?
Yeah, I go to their site. There's always Amazon, of course.
Okay, it's available on all those channels, right?
It's available. If you're in Napa Valley, the Book Mine is carrying it locally.
Always your local bookseller.
Always your local bookseller, of course, Meadowood. And then slowly, the book is being picked up by some retailers. Scarsdale Wine Merchant just grabbed it.
Oh, nice.
Market Wines in Charlottesville, Virginia.
I don't know why any good retailer wouldn't want it on the counter. I mean,
I think it's more
because they don't know about it, not that they think they should have it or not. So that's, hopefully we'll see that at more places. Now, if we want to follow you, which recently you're talking a lot about the book on social media, events and all that, or more information on you, where do we go?
I have winnowed down my social media to only a private account on Instagram because I like to post pictures of my kid and want to be able to boot any trolls. But I'm Kelli White Wine on Instagram. Okay. I'm trying to get better about that. But that's probably the best way to reach me publicly.
Okay. All right. So like we said, the book is available at, all booksellers. I noticed at the beginning of the book, you dedicate the book to 3 people with the initials SB. And I thought maybe now at this point, you need to make it 4 by including me as the 4th SB. What do you think of it? All right. It's a little selfish plug, but whatever. I'm only kidding. All right. I want to thank our guest, Kelli White. I want to thank her for taking time out of her busy schedule to talk about her new book. And I just want to remind people, if it seems like, I'm complimenting the book or fawning over it or whatever, I am, because why else would I have Kelli on the show? If the book sucked, I wouldn't have you on the show. So people are like, what do you love that? Yeah, I do. That's why I invited Kelli. So I want people, to understand that. And it's one thing for me to talk about it. It's another, for you to talk about it. So thanks for coming on and doing that. I want to thank our engineer, Armin, and everyone at the Heritage Radio Network. I'm Sam BenRuby, and you've been listening to The Grape Nation. The Grape Nation is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.